The evening had been calm, almost peaceful, with the soft hum of insects in the air and the faint laughter of children drifting from the backyards. The sun was dipping behind the rooftops, painting the quiet street in shades of orange and purple. Most families were indoors finishing dinner, their windows glowing warmly as night slowly crept in. It was the kind of evening where people expected nothing more dramatic than a dog barking or a child chasing a ball into the street. But peace never lasted long in this neighborhood, not when Karen, the infamous HOA president, decided to make her presence known. Without warning, the growl of her car engine echoed down the narrow street, breaking the silence. Heads turned, curtains twitched, and neighbors instinctively pulled back from their windows when they saw the familiar flash of her red car. She drove not with care but with arrogance, as if the road and every driveway belonged to her alone. Her headlights swung sharply across fences and porches before she turned her wheel and, without hesitation, steered directly into a driveway that wasn't hers. She parked right in front of the house at the end of the street. The house that belonged to the man everyone had begun to notice but didn't know much about. Her tires screeched slightly as she stopped, the noise cutting through the warm night air like a warning shot. Karen stepped out of the car with the air of someone stepping onto her personal stage. She didn't glance around to see if anyone was watching, though she knew they were. She thrived on it. She slammed the door shut, locked it with a sharp beep, and marched away from the car without a second thought. Her smirk lingered as if daring anyone to stop her. To her, this was not an offense, not even an act worth discussing. To her, it was a statement. She was untouchable, and this street was hers. From behind curtains and blinds, neighbors peeked cautiously. Some whispered to each other in hushed tones. She did it again, one muttered, shaking his head. That's not even her driveway. A woman pulled her daughter back from the window, whispering, "Stay quiet, don't let her see you watching." 4 years, Karen had ruled with threats of fines and violation letters, punishing families for the smallest things. Flowers planted without approval, curtains that didn't match the community standard, a child's toy left on the lawn. She held power not through kindness or fairness but through fear, and most had learned to stay silent when she acted out of line. Yet even they felt a flicker of unease watching her park in someone else's space, as if this act was bolder, louder, more dangerous than usual. The man whose driveway she had taken sat inside his house, sipping tea quietly by the window. He had returned earlier than usual that evening and had watched her car slide confidently into his property. His eyes didn't widen in surprise, nor did his hands tremble with anger. He simply observed, calm as ever, as though he had been waiting for this. His neighbors didn't know much about him. He was quiet, polite, and rarely spoke at HOA meetings. He paid no mind to Karen's constant posturing, and she seemed to despise him for it. Where others bent under her rules, he never bowed, never argued, but never obeyed in the way she wanted either. It was his calmness that unsettled her the most, and so she tested him, again and again, pushing further each time. Parking in his driveway was just her latest move in a game only she believed she was winning. The man stood up, set his teacup aside, and stepped onto his porch. The neighbors watching held their breath. Would he yell? Would he call the police? Would he challenge her openly in the street? They leaned closer, hearts racing, but he did none of those things. He simply stood there, his calm gaze on the red car that now blocked his driveway. He didn't move to touch it, didn't shout her name, didn't even frown. He just watched. His silence carried a weight heavier than shouting could, and though he said nothing, the neighbors felt something shift in the air. It was as though he was already planning his response, a quiet plan they couldn't yet see. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared into her house across the street, not sparing him a glance. To her, it was done. She had proven, yet again, that she could do whatever she wished. She had parked where she wanted, when she wanted, and the message was clear. No one would dare to stop her. She tossed her keys onto a table, poured herself a glass of wine, and smiled. "He'll deal with it," she muttered to herself. She didn't bother imagining what he might say or do. In her mind, his silence meant surrender. But the neighbors knew better. They saw the way he had stood there, calm and unmoved. They saw something in his eyes, something steady and sharp, like the first glint of steel. They whispered about it long after they closed their curtains. "He won't let this slide," one said softly. "He's different." Another nodded, eyes wide. "Karen thinks she owns this place, but she may have picked the wrong man to test." The night deepened, and the street grew quiet again, but the calm was different now. It was not the peace of ordinary evenings but the silence before a storm. The neighbors lay awake, restless, wondering what would come next. Some dreamed of confrontation, others feared retaliation, but all agreed on one thing: something had begun. Inside his home, the man sat back down at his table. He pulled the leather folder closer, opening it carefully. Inside were documents, photos, and records he had kept quietly over the years, waiting for the right moment. His calm eyes studied them in the dim light. He did not rush. He did not seethe with anger. He only prepared, steady and deliberate. Outside, Karen's car sat arrogantly in his driveway, the final spark on a fire that had been waiting too long to burn. By morning, the neighbors would look out their windows again, wondering if the car was still there, wondering if the man had finally decided to act. They would whisper and speculate, but none of them would know the truth, that Karen's arrogance had pushed too far, and that her car's place in his driveway was only the beginning of a story that would end with its disappearance, and with her fear replacing theirs. The morning sun lit up the street, but the tension from the night before still hung heavy in the air. Curtains shifted as neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering about the car still parked boldly in the man's driveway. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others muttered curses under their breath, but no one dared step outside to challenge it. Karen's red car gleamed as though mocking the entire neighborhood, its presence louder than any words. The man walked out of his house calmly, dressed neatly, holding his keys in one hand and a folder under his arm. He looked at the car for a long moment, his face unreadable. Neighbors held their breath, expecting him to shout, to slam his fist, to call the police. Instead, he walked down the driveway and stood silently beside the car. He didn't touch it, didn't try to move it. He simply looked at it, and his calm eyes carried a weight that made even those watching from their windows feel uneasy. Minutes later, Karen emerged from her own house across the street. She was dressed in her usual sharp jacket, sunglasses perched on her face, her lips curved in a smug smile. She didn't glance at the neighbors' houses or the eyes watching her. She looked straight at the man, standing by the car, and laughed. "Still there, I see," she called mockingly. "Guess you don't mind after all. Good to know my spot is safe." Her voice was loud, meant to carry across the street, meant to remind everyone that she still ruled here. The man didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, let the sound of her arrogance hang in the air before speaking. His voice was low, calm, and steady. "This is my driveway." Karen tilted her head, smirk widening. "Your driveway? No, no, no. This entire street is HOA property, which means it's under my control. You may think this little patch of concrete belongs to you, but as long as you live here, I decide how it's used." She took a step closer, crossing her arms. "And if I decide my car goes here, then it goes here. That's how it works." The neighbors whispered louder now. Some couldn't believe how boldly she spoke. Others were stunned at the man's composure. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even frown. He only said, "This driveway belongs to me, not you. You may make rules, but rules don't erase truth." His words made Karen laugh out loud, the sound sharp and grating. "Truth?" she scoffed. "The only truth here is that I make the rules, and you follow them. Everyone does. Look around. Do you see anyone daring to stand up to me? They know better. You should learn too." She leaned closer, lowering her voice but loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You're not special. You'll bend, or you'll break." For a moment, silence blanketed the street. The man looked at her calmly, his eyes steady, and replied, "I don't bend. And I don't break. But you will." His words weren't loud, but they carried across the street like a warning bell. Neighbors gasped softly, shocked that someone had finally spoken to Karen this way. Karen's smile faltered for a second, then twisted into a sneer. Big words, she snapped. Let's see if you can back them up. Because if you don't like my car here, too bad. It's staying. Call the police, file your little complaints. It won't matter. I control them too. She turned and strutted back toward her house, tossing her keys onto her porch table as if declaring victory. The man didn't move. He watched her leave, calm and unmoved, then turned back toward his house. The neighbors noticed the faintest smile on his face, not one of defeat but of quiet certainty. It was the kind of smile that suggested he already knew how this story would end. And though no one dared say it aloud, they felt it too. Something had shifted. Karen believed she had humiliated him, proven her power once again. But to the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, it looked different. It looked like she had just crossed a line she wouldn't return from. That night, whispers spread through the neighborhood like fire. Did you hear what he said to her? He told her she would break. He didn't even raise his voice. He just stood there. She thinks she won, but I saw his eyes. He has a plan. Some were afraid, others hopeful, but all agreed on one thing: this time felt different. Karen wasn't fighting a submissive neighbor. She was fighting someone who didn't fear her, and that made her dangerous enemy. Meanwhile, in his quiet house, the man opened the leather folder again, spreading the papers across his table. Deeds, photographs, letters, and reports lay neatly arranged. He studied them carefully, his calm eyes tracing every line. Outside, Karen's car still sat in his driveway, gleaming arrogantly under the streetlight. But inside, plans were being made, steady and precise. The kind of plans that didn't need shouting, only patience. By the next morning, the neighbors would see Karen's car still there, blocking his way as always. They would shake their heads, mutter that nothing had changed. But deep down, they knew they had witnessed the beginning of something. And though they couldn't yet imagine it, the day was coming soon when that red car would vanish from the man's driveway, and with it, the fear Karen had built her power upon. The following days turned the street into a stage for Karen's arrogance. Every morning her red car sat in the man's driveway, shining like a trophy she displayed to remind the neighbors of her control. Sometimes she parked at an angle, blocking him completely, as if daring him to react. Other times she left it overnight, headlights facing his front door like mocking eyes. Neighbors whispered nervously behind their curtains, shaking their heads in disbelief. How long will he put up with this? One muttered. He can't fight her, another said. No one ever does. Yet even as they whispered, they remembered the words he had spoken. Calm, steady, and certain. I don't bend. I don't break. But you will. Those words lingered in their minds like a spark that refused to die. Karen flaunted her defiance with every step. She strutted around the neighborhood in her red jacket, waving papers and handing out fines for trivial things. She fined an old man for having a cracked flower pot, scolded a young mother for leaving chalk drawings on her driveway, and even shouted at children for riding bikes too close to her yard. Her voice carried through the street like a whip, sharp and cruel. Each time, neighbors lowered their heads, too afraid to answer. But something was different now. When Karen turned her back, their eyes shifted toward the quiet house at the end of the street. They looked to the man, not as a victim, but as a figure standing between them and the storm. One evening, as the sun set and families retreated indoors, Karen marched across the street with her phone in hand. She pounded on the man's door, her voice shrill and demanding. You think you can ignore me? You think you can threaten me? I run this place, she shouted. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, holding their breath. The man opened the door slowly, his calm eyes meeting hers without a flicker of fear. He didn't shout back, didn't defend himself. He simply listened as she raged, her words spilling like venom. Finally, when she paused to breathe, he spoke in his low, steady voice. This is my property. Move your car. Karen laughed harshly, throwing her head back. Your property? Don't make me laugh. You may hold your little papers, but I hold the power. The police listen to me. The board listens to me. The neighbors obey me. You're alone. She jabbed her finger into his chest, her smile cruel. "And I will make your life so miserable that you'll wish you had never bought this house." The man didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He only replied, "You've mistaken silence for weakness. That mistake will cost you." His words were calm, almost gentle, but they carried like thunder across the quiet street. Neighbors gasped from their windows, unable to believe someone had spoken to Karen that way. Karen's face turned red with fury. She hissed through clenched teeth, "We'll see." She turned sharply, marching back to her house, her heels striking the pavement like gunshots. Her car stayed in his driveway that night, bold and unmoving, as if it were her flag of conquest planted in enemy territory. Inside his home, the man returned to his table where the leather folder lay open. He carefully placed new photos inside, images of her car parked illegally on his property, time-stamped and undeniable. He added notes, dates, and the records of her threats. His plan was methodical, each step precise, his patience unshaken. He didn't rush, because he knew that arrogance always destroyed itself, and Karen's arrogance had already gone too far. By the next morning, whispers spread faster than ever. He stood up to her. He told her it would cost her. She looked shaken. The neighbors repeated the story again and again, their fear slowly shifting into something else, hope. For years they had bowed their heads, obeyed her rules, paid her fines. But now, for the first time, someone had stood firm and told her no. It was as if his calm voice had cracked the shell of fear they had all lived under, and once cracked, it could never be sealed again. Karen, however, grew even bolder. She called an emergency HOA meeting, gathering neighbors in the clubhouse. She stormed to the front with papers in hand, her voice sharp and commanding. "This man is a problem," she declared. "He refuses to obey rules, refuses to respect this community, and now he threatens me directly. We cannot allow him to stay. I will be filing for removal, and you will all support me, or you will face consequences." She scanned the room, expecting nods of obedience. Some neighbors lowered their heads, old habits hard to break. But others glanced at each other uneasily, their silence heavier than words. For the first time, Karen saw hesitation in their eyes, and it rattled her. In the back of the room, the man sat quietly, listening. He didn't rise to argue, didn't interrupt her tirade. He only watched, calm and steady, as if her shouting meant nothing. And perhaps it did, because the neighbors were no longer blind. They saw her fury, her desperation, and they saw his silence, stronger than her loudest scream. That night, when the street grew quiet again, Karen's car sat arrogantly in his driveway as always. But the neighbors looked at it differently now. It no longer seemed like a symbol of her power. It seemed like the first crack in the wall of her control, the weight that would finally drag her down. They didn't know when it would happen, or how, but they knew something was coming, something final. And inside his house, the man closed the folder and whispered softly to himself, "Patience. The time will come." His calm eyes shone in the dim light, steady and certain. And outside, Karen's car gleamed in the driveway, not knowing it was already living its last days there. The morning air was thick with tension as sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Neighbors rushed to their windows, lifting blinds and peeking through curtains, their hearts pounding. They had seen this before, Karen calling the police to enforce her will, but something about today felt different. Her red car was once again sitting boldly in the man's driveway, a silent challenge, a scarlet flag planted on ground she didn't own. She stood outside near the car, arms crossed, her sharp red jacket catching the morning light like armor. Her phone still clutched in one hand, she barked at the neighbors gathered nearby. "He thinks he can ignore the HOA? He thinks he can threaten me? Not in my community. Watch what happens when someone defies me." The man stepped out of his house calmly, his expression unreadable. He carried the leather folder under his arm, his stride steady, his presence quiet but commanding. He did not look at Karen, nor did he look at the neighbors. His eyes were fixed on the approaching flashing lights, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The police cars pulled up, tires crunching against gravel, lights swirling red and blue across the quiet street. Two officers stepped out, their expressions neutral, but their gaze quickly flicked between Karen's fiery stance and the man's composed calm. Karen wasted no time. She stormed forward, waving her hands wildly. "Officers, thank God you're here. This man is trespassing on community property. He's harassing me. He refuses to follow the HOA rules. And now he's threatening the safety of this neighborhood. I demand you arrest him and remove him immediately." Her voice rang sharp and shrill, filling the air with the same fear she had used for years to control those around her. The neighbors held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Many remembered the times she had called the police before. Over a child's lemonade stand, over a man painting his shutters the wrong color, over a dog barking too loudly. Each time, she had won. Each time, the police had backed her up. But today, the scene felt heavier, as if the ground itself knew the tide was shifting. The lead officer turned to the man. "Sir, do you have anything to say regarding this complaint?" His voice was professional, but there was curiosity in his eyes. The man nodded once, stepping forward calmly. He opened the leather folder, pulling out documents with practiced precision. He handed them over without a word. The officer flipped through them, his eyes narrowing as he read. He motioned for his partner to look as well, and together they examined the papers closely. Seals, signatures, and dates filled the pages, property deeds, violation records, photographic evidence. Karen's smirk faltered as she saw the officer's expressions shift from suspicion to surprise. She tried to snatch the papers from their hands, shouting, "Those are fake. He forged them. Don't you see? He's trying to trick all of you." But the officer pulled the documents away from her grasp, his tone sharp. These are not forgeries. These are legally recorded property deeds. This driveway belongs to him. Not to the HOA. Not to you." Gasps rippled through the crowd of neighbors. They pressed closer to their windows, some covering their mouths, others whispering furiously. "He owns it?" "All this time?" one woman murmured. "She's been lying," another hissed. Children peered from behind their parents' legs, their wide eyes fixed on the man who stood so calmly against Karen's fury. Karen's face turned red, her voice cracking as she shouted, "That can't be true. The HOA rules apply to everyone. If he thinks he's special, then he's dead wrong. He's nothing." Her words trembled, her usual confidence slipping. For the first time, the neighbors noticed the desperation in her voice. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to the man. His voice was firm, carrying finality. "You cannot park your vehicle on someone else's private property. It is a violation of the law, regardless of HOA rules. If you continue, your car will be towed, and further charges may follow." His partner added, "And if you continue filing false reports, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action for harassment." The neighbors erupted into whispers again, louder this time, the sound of chains breaking. They had feared her for so long, but now they saw her standing exposed, her power slipping like sand through her fingers. Some even stepped onto their porches, their faces no longer bowed but lifted, watching her downfall unfold. The man didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply tucked the folder back under his arm and said quietly, "Truth does not bend to fear." His calm words cut sharper than Karen's screams, and the neighbors heard them as if they were meant for them all. Karen shrieked, pointing wildly at him. "You'll regret this. All of you will. Without me, this place will collapse into chaos." But no one moved, no one defended her. Even her lawyer, who had arrived late and stood near the edge of the crowd, lowered his eyes and said nothing. The officers turned back to her, their patience gone. "Move your car. Now." Her hands shook as she fumbled for her keys. The smirk was gone, replaced by a twisted scowl as she stormed toward the car. She climbed in, slammed the door, and reversed sharply out of the driveway, tires screeching. The neighbors flinched at the noise, but they didn't retreat. They stood taller, their eyes following her as she sped away, her power broken in that moment more than ever before. When the dust settled and the street grew quiet again, the neighbors turned their eyes back to the man. He stood calmly at the edge of his driveway, his calm gaze meeting theirs. No words were needed, but still he spoke. Fear is loudest before it disappears. The neighbors nodded, their hearts pounding with something new, hope. For the first time, they believed Karen's reign might truly end. That night, the whispers in the neighborhood were no longer about fear. They were about freedom, about a quiet man with calm eyes who had shown them the truth. And though Karen's car still gleamed under the streetlight when she returned later, everyone knew it wouldn't stay there forever. Its days were numbered, just like her power. The next day the street was buzzing like a hive, neighbors whispering at fences and porches, their voices low but urgent. The story of Karen being forced to move her car by the police had spread like wildfire. Some were laughing quietly behind closed doors, others still too cautious to show their joy, but everyone felt the shift. For years Karen had ruled with an iron fist, and now cracks in her armor were showing. But Karen herself refused to accept defeat. She paced inside her house, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor, her red jacket tossed across a chair as if even it had betrayed her. Her lawyer sat at her dining table, flipping nervously through a stack of papers, his expression uneasy. "Karen," he said quietly, "the officers were clear. If you keep pushing, you could face charges." But Karen slammed her hand down on the table, rattling glasses. "Charges? For me? Never. I built this neighborhood. I made it what it is. Without me, they'd be nothing." Her eyes blazed as she jabbed a finger toward the window where the man's house sat calmly at the end of the street. "He's nothing but a trespasser who thinks a few papers make him powerful. He humiliated me, and I will make sure he pays for it." Her lawyer shifted uneasily, lowering his voice. "You've already been caught presenting false evidence once. Another mistake, and you'll lose everything." Karen glared at him with such intensity that he fell silent. "Then I won't make a mistake," she hissed. "This time, I'll make it so airtight even he can't wriggle free." She gathered her papers, her hands trembling not with fear but with a manic determination. "Tomorrow, I'll file for an injunction. I'll claim his property is a hazard, unfit for community living. The court will listen. They always listen." That evening, the neighbors gathered in small groups, talking nervously about her next move. "She's not giving up," one man muttered. "She'll drag this out until we're all paying for it." A mother shook her head firmly. "She's desperate now. That's when people make mistakes." Their eyes drifted toward the man's house, its porch light glowing softly. He sat there quietly with his wife, his children playing nearby, the leather folder resting calmly at his side. He did not look worried, did not look angry. He looked steady, as though he knew exactly where the path was leading. The next morning, Karen stormed into the courthouse, her arms full of papers. She slapped them down on the clerk's desk, her voice sharp and commanding. "File these immediately," she demanded. "This man's property is unsafe. His driveway is a hazard, his house an eyesore, his entire presence a violation of community standards. He is a danger to order, and I demand he be removed." The clerks exchanged wary glances but took the documents, their pens scratching quietly as the forms were processed. Karen smirked, convinced victory was near. But word spread quickly, as it always did. By the afternoon, neighbors knew she had filed new complaints. They gathered outside the man's house, nervous but curious, whispering about what might happen next. Would the court side with her again? Would the man finally be forced out? The tension grew heavy, but when the man stepped onto his porch, calm and composed, something shifted. He carried the folder in one hand, and his eyes swept across the crowd. "She will try again," he said quietly, his voice carrying without force. "But truth is patient. Fear rushes, and fear stumbles when it runs too fast." The neighbors nodded slowly, their hearts steadying. That night, Karen celebrated in her own twisted way. She sat with a glass of wine, staring out at the man's driveway where her car sat once again, bold and defiant. She laughed to herself, convinced she had regained control. "Let's see him smile tomorrow," she muttered. But her laughter was hollow, echoing in her empty house. For though her car gleamed in the driveway, she hadn't noticed the camera hidden near the porch light, its red dot blinking quietly. Nor had she noticed the growing courage in the neighbor's eyes, or the way their whispers no longer carried only fear but defiance. By morning, the evidence would speak louder than her screams. The car she flaunted like a weapon was already her undoing, and the man's silence was the most dangerous reply of all. For Karen, it was just another day of power. For everyone else, it was the beginning of her end. The courthouse was crowded from the moment the doors opened. Neighbors filled every bench, their whispers echoing off the high walls. The story of Karen's new filing had spread across the valley like wildfire, and no one wanted to miss what might finally break her grip on the community. Reporters gathered near the back, cameras ready, pens scribbling in their notebooks. The air carried a strange mix of tension and excitement, like the crackle of a storm about to split the sky. At the front, the man sat calmly with his wife, the leather folder resting on the table before him. His eyes were steady, his posture relaxed, as though he had walked this path 100 times before. Across from him, Karen stormed in, her heels striking the floor like gunshots, her red jacket blazing under the courtroom lights. She slammed a thick stack of papers onto her table, glaring at the man with triumph burning in her eyes. The judge entered, and silence fell immediately. His gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. "This court is now in session," he declared. "We will hear the matter brought forth regarding the alleged hazards and violations concerning the property in question." He turned to Karen's lawyer. "Proceed." The lawyer rose nervously, clearing his throat before launching into his argument. "Your Honor, we have evidence that the defendant's property is unsafe, unfit for community standards, and in violation of numerous HOA regulations. We present inspection reports that prove hazardous conditions, including improper driveway construction, unapproved exterior changes, and threats to neighborhood safety." He waved the stack of papers dramatically, his voice shaking slightly. Karen jumped to her feet, cutting him off. "And let me add," she shouted, her voice sharp and desperate. "This man has openly threatened me, refused to obey rules, and endangered the peace of our neighborhood. He must be removed. If he stays, this community will collapse." Her voice cracked at the end, but she smiled proudly, convinced she had delivered a killing blow. The judge raised an eyebrow, taking the papers from her lawyer. He flipped through them slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. The room held its breath, waiting. Finally, he set the papers down with a sharp slap. "These reports are sloppy. The dates do not match. The signatures are inconsistent. And the seals," he held one page up for the court to see, "are clearly photocopied." Gasps swept through the room. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering furiously, some covering their mouths in shock. The Attorney General rose slowly, his voice calm but cutting. "Your Honor, we examined these reports before this hearing. They are forgeries. Fabricated documents created to deceive this court. Not one inspection took place. No official signed these pages. This is not evidence, it is fraud." He slammed the papers onto the bench, the sound like a hammer striking stone. Karen's face went pale, then flushed red. She stumbled forward, shouting, "No, they're real. I ordered those inspections myself. They were done properly, I swear it." But the judge's eyes burned into her, his voice icy. "You ordered them? You are not authorized to order inspections, nor to fabricate their results. Do you realize the seriousness of this? You are presenting false evidence in a court of law." The neighbors erupted, their whispers turning into open voices. "She forged them," someone shouted. "She lied to all of us," another cried. A mother stood, tears in her eyes. "She fined me for roses and lied about it too." The room filled with years of anger spilling out all at once. Karen slammed her fists on the table, screaming above the noise. "Lies! You're all liars. You need me. Without me, this place will burn to the ground. You're nothing without my rules." Her voice cracked as she pointed wildly at the crowd. "Tell him. Tell the judge you need me." But no one answered. Dozens of eyes glared back, cold and unforgiving. Her power was crumbling right before her. The man rose then, walking calmly to the center of the room. His voice was quiet, but it carried into every corner. For years, she ruled by fear. She fined you for shutters, for flowers, for toys, for laughter. She shouted and threatened, and you believed you had no choice but to obey. But fear is brittle. Lies are weaker still. And today, you see them both shatter. He turned his eyes toward Karen, steady and unflinching. You thought you owned this valley, but truth cannot be owned. Truth stands, even when fear falls. The neighbors rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, chanting together. No more fear. No more lies. No more fear. Their voices thundered through the courtroom, shaking the very walls. The judge struck his gavel for order, but even he did not hide the faint respect in his eyes as he looked at the man. This court will reconvene tomorrow for final judgment, he declared firmly. And it will be final. Karen collapsed back into her chair, her hands trembling, her papers scattered uselessly around her. She stared at the crowd chanting against her, her lips trembling as the reality sank in. For the first time, she was alone. Truly alone. The officers who once stood behind her now looked away. Her lawyer gathered his briefcase silently, his face flushed with shame. No one came to her defense. As the people poured out of the courthouse, lanterns glowed even in the daylight, lifted high in triumph. Their voices echoed through the streets, their chants rolling like thunder across the valley. The man stepped into the sunlight, his family at his side, his calm eyes steady. He spoke once, his words simple. Tomorrow, truth speaks louder than fear. The crowd roared, their lanterns blazing brighter, and the valley knew that the end of Karen's reign was closer than ever. The courthouse was overflowing the next morning, the benches packed with neighbors shoulder to shoulder, while more stood along the walls and crowded outside on the steps. The air buzzed with a restless energy, voices low but urgent, every whisper carrying the same question. What would Karen do now that her lies had been exposed? Reporters filled the back rows, cameras clicking, pens scratching furiously against paper. For years, they had heard rumors of the tyrannical HOA president. But now they were witnessing the unraveling of her power in real time. The man sat quietly at the front with his wife beside him, the leather folder resting on the table. His face remained calm, unreadable, his eyes steady as though none of the chaos touched him. He didn't fidget, didn't whisper, didn't boast. He simply waited. When Karen entered, the room shifted. She no longer carried herself like a ruler but like someone desperately clinging to a throne made of dust. Her red jacket was still on, but it was wrinkled, her hair slightly out of place, her smile forced and brittle. She clutched her papers like broken weapons, hugging them close to her chest. As she walked down the aisle, the neighbors didn't lower their eyes like they once did. Instead, they stared directly at her, some with anger, others with pity, but none with fear. She faltered under their gaze, her steps less certain than ever before, though she tried to cover it by raising her chin high. The judge entered and struck his gavel, silencing the murmurs. His voice was sharp, commanding. This court resumes. And today, before we move to final judgment, we will hear closing arguments from both sides. He gestured to Karen's lawyer, who stood hesitantly, his voice thinner than it had been earlier in the week. He repeated the same points, rules, order, community safety, but his words sounded hollow now. The neighbors exchanged glances, unimpressed, their faces firm. Even the lawyer's eyes betrayed doubt as he spoke, as though he knew he was standing on crumbling ground. Then Karen rose. She slammed her hands on the table and shouted before the judge could even call her. You're all fools. Every single one of you. Do you think you can live without me? Do you think your pretty gardens and perfect little houses will survive without my order? Her voice cracked as she pointed at the neighbors, her face twisted in fury. You'll drown in chaos without me. I kept you in line. I protected you from yourselves. And this, she turned toward the man, her eyes blazing. This fraud thinks he can replace me? He is nothing. Nothing. The neighbors gasped, some recoiling at the venom in her words. But then, something changed. A woman stood slowly from the benches, her voice trembling but strong. You fined me for planting roses, Karen. You tore them out of my garden while my children cried. You didn't protect us. You destroyed us. She sat down, tears streaming, but her words hung heavy in the air. Another man stood, his cane shaking in his hand. You fined me for my shutters. I painted them 3 times, and it was never enough. You stole from me until I had nothing left. That wasn't protection. That was cruelty. He lowered himself back down, his head high. One by one, neighbors rose to their feet. A father spoke of his son's swing set being destroyed. A widow described her mailbox torn out. A young couple told of being humiliated in front of everyone for hanging laundry on a line. Each voice layered over the next, stronger, louder, until the entire room was filled with the weight of years of pain. Karen screamed over them, her voice shrill and desperate. Lies. All lies. You're ungrateful, all of you. I built this community. You'd be nothing without me. But no one sat back down. The neighbors stayed on their feet, their voices rising together until they merged into one. No more fear. No more lies. No more fear. The chant thundered through the courtroom, rolling like a storm, shaking the very walls. Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras capturing the moment the community that had once bowed now stood united. The judge struck his gavel again and again, calling for order, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of something in his eyes, respect for the people finally finding their voice. When silence fell at last, he looked at Karen coldly. This court has heard enough. The people you claim to protect have spoken. Their testimony is clear. Your power has been built not on order, but on fear. The man rose then, walking slowly to the center of the courtroom. His presence quieted the crowd without a word. His calm eyes swept across the room, settling on Karen at last. His voice was soft, but it carried into every corner. For years, you believed silence meant obedience. You thought fear was strength. But silence is not surrender. And fear is not power. You built your house on lies, and now it crumbles. The truth stands. It always stands. The neighbors erupted again, clapping, cheering, their chants filling the air once more. Karen sank into her chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. She clutched her papers, but they felt like ashes in her grip. She looked around wildly, searching for support, but found only cold stares. Even her lawyer avoided her eyes, closing his briefcase quietly as though he was already preparing to leave her behind. The judge struck the gavel one last time. This court will deliver final judgment tomorrow morning, he declared. And it will be final. His voice was firm, heavy with finality. As the people poured out of the courthouse, their lanterns glowing in the daylight, their chants echoed through the streets. No more fear. No more fear. Reporters followed eagerly, capturing the roar of freedom as it rolled across the valley. Karen slipped out a side door, her shoulders hunched, her once proud red jacket hanging heavy on her frame. For the first time, she looked small, her shadow shrinking against the courthouse wall. And the man stepped into the sunlight, his family at his side, neighbors surrounding him with cheers and gratitude. He did not smile boastfully, nor did he speak loudly. He only raised his calm eyes to the lanterns glowing in the crowd and said quietly, "Tomorrow, the last chain breaks." His words settled into every heart, and the people roared in response, their voices shaking the sky. That night, the valley did not sleep. Lanterns glowed on every porch, lining the streets like rivers of fire, their flames flickering against the dark sky. Families gathered outside their homes, voices carrying across the quiet lake. For years their whispers had been hushed, spoken behind closed doors in fear of being overheard. But now their words flowed freely, bold and unashamed. They spoke of the day's events, of the courtroom erupting with voices that had been silent for too long, of Karen's face when her lies were exposed. Children sat wide-eyed as their parents told them, "She can't scare us anymore. Tomorrow, it ends." The neighbors laughed together, shared food, and even sang songs, their voices blending into the night air. The valley, once smothered by silence, now breathed with life. At the cabin, the man sat quietly on his porch, the leather folder resting on the table beside him. His wife joined him, her eyes soft as she studied his calm face. "Tomorrow will be the end," she whispered, her voice carrying both relief and worry. He shook his head gently, his eyes steady on the glowing lanterns reflecting across the water. "No," he said, "tomorrow will be the beginning. Fear ends, but truth continues. What begins after fear is freedom." Their children slept peacefully inside, unaware of the weight of the moment but safe in a way they had never been before. Across the street, Karen paced inside her darkened house. The curtains were drawn tight, but the glow of the neighbors' lanterns seeped in around the edges, haunting her. She tried to drown it out with the sound of her heels on the floor, the slam of her fist on the table, the crumple of papers in her hands. Her lawyer had abandoned her hours earlier, muttering something about unwinnable cases. Alone, she stared at the red jacket draped over a chair, the same one she had worn like a crown. Now it looked like a costume, empty and powerless. She poured herself a glass of wine, but her hands trembled so badly the liquid spilled across the counter. She whispered to herself, "They need me. They've always needed me. Without me, they'll fall apart." But even as she said it, she heard the echoes of the crowd chanting in her memory, "No more fear. No more lies," and for the first time, she felt what they had felt all along, helplessness. The night stretched long, every hour heavy with expectation. Some neighbors stayed awake until dawn, their lanterns still burning, unwilling to let the darkness creep back in. Others finally drifted to sleep, clutching the hope that tomorrow would bring freedom at last. The air was thick with anticipation, a quiet storm building that no one could stop. By morning, the courthouse steps were already crowded. Families arrived together, carrying lanterns they refused to extinguish, their flames dancing even in the pale light of sunrise. Reporters gathered in greater numbers than ever before, their cameras flashing as they captured the sea of determined faces. The chant began softly at first, then grew louder as more voices joined in, "No more fear. No more fear." The sound rolled through the valley like thunder, a declaration that this day belonged not to Karen, but to them. The man arrived quietly, his wife walking at his side, the leather folder tucked firmly under his arm. The crowd parted for him instinctively, their lanterns raised higher as he passed. Some reached out to touch his shoulder, others whispered blessings, and many simply nodded with gratitude. His calm presence steadied them, reminding them why they had found their voices in the first place. He didn't wave, didn't boast, didn't shout. His silence spoke louder than any words could. Minutes later, Karen appeared. She stepped from her car dressed once more in her red jacket, her shoulders squared, her chin high. But this time, no one looked away. No one lowered their gaze. Instead, the crowd turned to her with cold stares, some crossing their arms, others whispering openly. A few even laughed bitterly as she marched past, clutching her papers like lifelines. The jacket that had once commanded fear now looked like a desperate attempt to hold on to a crown she no longer wore. Her lips twitched in a forced smile, but her eyes betrayed the panic burning beneath. Inside, the courtroom filled to bursting. The judge entered, his gavel striking loudly, demanding silence. His face was grim, his eyes heavy with the weight of what was to come. "This court reconvenes for final judgment," he declared. "But before the decision is delivered, each side will have one last opportunity to speak." Karen's lawyer had not returned. She was alone. She stood shakily, her papers rattling in her trembling hands. "Your Honor," she began, her voice too loud, too desperate. "These people don't understand what they're doing. They think they want freedom, but freedom without rules is chaos. I kept them safe. I gave them order. They will regret this. They'll see they need me." Her words grew shriller with every sentence, her voice cracking as she screamed, "I am the reason this community exists. Without me, it dies." The neighbors booed openly now, some shaking their heads, others shouting back, "You destroyed us. You lied to us. We don't need you." Their voices rose, fierce and unshaken, until the entire room thundered with defiance. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but his eyes had already hardened. He turned to the man, who rose slowly, his calm presence silencing the crowd without force. He walked to the center of the courtroom, the leather folder still under his arm, and spoke softly. For years, fear spoke loudly here. It silenced your laughter, stole your gardens, punished your children, and claimed your homes. But today, fear is silent. Today, truth speaks. And tomorrow, freedom will live here again. His words settled into the crowd like a promise, and cheers erupted, chants shaking the walls once more. The judge raised his gavel. This court will now deliver its ruling. The room fell into absolute silence, every eye fixed on him, every heart beating faster. Karen's hands shook so badly she dropped her papers, scattering them across the floor. No one bent to pick them up. Her face drained of color as she realized she was standing on the edge of the end. And the gavel struck down with a crack that echoed like thunder, sealing her fate forever. The judge's gavel echoed through the chamber, and the silence that followed was so deep it felt like the entire valley held its breath at once. Every eye in the crowded courtroom was fixed on him, every heart beating faster, every whisper stilled. The man stood calmly at his table, his wife's hand resting gently on his arm, the leather folder lying before him like a symbol of quiet strength. Across the aisle, Karen clutched at the edge of her table, her papers scattered across the floor where they had fallen, her red jacket wrinkled and heavy, her face pale but twisted with defiance. The judge's voice cut through the silence, measured and steady. This court has heard testimony from the residents of this community. We have examined documents, deeds, and reports. We have seen the actions of the HOA, and we have seen the lies presented in this courtroom as truth. The evidence is overwhelming. The land in question, including the driveway, the pool, and surrounding property, is not under the authority of the HOA. It belongs, by legal deed and binding record, to this man and his family. Gasps rippled through the crowd, quickly followed by cheers, though the judge raised his gavel to keep the order. His gaze sharpened as it fell on Karen. Furthermore, this court finds that the HOA, under your leadership, abused its authority, fined residents unfairly, destroyed property without cause, and attempted to silence opposition through intimidation. Effective immediately, the HOA is dissolved, its power revoked, its rules void. And as for you, your attempts to deceive this court with fabricated documents will be referred for criminal investigation. The room exploded. Neighbors leapt to their feet, clapping, shouting, their voices filling the chamber like thunder. Some wept openly, others embraced, and many simply raised their lanterns high, their flames glowing even in the bright daylight pouring through the windows. The chant began again, rolling through the room until it shook the very walls. No more fear. No more lies. No more fear. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, microphones captured the roar of freedom as it poured from the courtroom into the streets outside. Karen staggered back, her hands trembling, her face drained of color. No, this isn't possible, she stammered, her voice breaking. You can't do this to me. I built this community. I made it what it is. You need me. She whirled on the neighbors, her eyes wild. Tell him. Tell the judge you need me. But the people she had ruled with fear stared back at her coldly. Some shook their heads, others turned away. For the first time, she faced not silence but rejection. The officers stepped forward, firm but not harsh. You need to leave. She shook her head furiously, backing away, her voice cracking into a scream. No, this isn't over. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back when it all falls apart. But her words were drowned out by the chants and cheers of the crowd. The officers guided her toward the door, her papers trailing from her hands, fluttering across the floor like broken wings. No one bent to pick them up. The red jacket that once symbolized her power now looked like nothing more than fabric hanging heavy on her shoulders as she was led away. The man rose slowly, his presence commanding silence without needing to ask. The cheers softened, the chants faded, and all eyes turned to him. He stepped to the center of the courtroom, his calm gaze sweeping across the crowd. His voice was soft, but it carried into every corner, steady and sure. For years, fear sat in these homes. It whispered in your gardens, shouted at your children, stole from your families. And you bowed your heads, believing you had no choice. But today, you stood. You spoke. And fear has fallen. This valley is yours again. Not mine, not hers, but yours. The neighbors erupted once more, clapping, cheering, tears streaming down faces both young and old. They rushed forward to thank him, to shake his hand, to embrace him. The judge struck his gavel for order, but even he couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at his lips as he watched the community reclaim itself. The man only nodded quietly, accepting their gratitude with calm dignity, never boasting, never raising his voice. Outside, the courthouse steps became a festival. Lanterns glowed even in the noon sun, lifted high as symbols of victory. Families sang, children laughed, and the chant rolled through the valley, echoing off the hills and across the lake. No more fear. No more lies. The reporters captured every moment, their headlines already forming about the downfall of the tyrant and the triumph of the people. Karen, escorted to her car, covered her face with her hands as cameras flashed around her. She refused to look at the crowd, refused to see the joy on their faces. She slammed her car door and drove away, her tires screeching, but no one flinched. Her reign was over. She was no longer a queen, only a shadow fading into the distance. The man stepped into the sunlight with his wife and children at his side. The neighbors surrounded them, their lanterns glowing bright, their voices lifted high. He looked out across the valley, his calm eyes reflecting the flames, and spoke once more. Truth cannot be silenced. And truth will remain long after fear is gone. The people cheered, their voices rolling across the water, shaking the hills, carrying a message that would never be forgotten. The valley was free. That night the valley shone brighter than it ever had before. Lanterns glowed on every porch, lining the streets, the docks, and the paths leading down to the water. The lake reflected the lights like a sheet of stars, shimmering in the warm summer air. Families gathered outside, children ran freely, laughter and music spilled into the night. It was not the quiet, fearful neighborhood it once had been. It was alive, unchained, and proud. People shared food at long wooden tables, neighbors who had barely spoken for years now sitting side by side, clinking glasses, trading stories of survival under Karen's reign. They laughed about the fines, about the absurd rules, about the threats that once terrified them. Each story ended with the same phrase spoken boldly: no more fear. The man sat on his porch with his wife and children, watching the celebration unfold around them. His wife leaned against him, her voice soft but filled with awe. "It feels like a dream," she whispered. "For years we lived under her shadow, and now, look at them." Her eyes traveled across the lantern-lit street where neighbors danced barefoot, where children splashed in the shallow edges of the pool that once carried shame and rules, and where music filled the air without restraint. He nodded, his calm eyes reflecting the glow. "They were always ready," he said softly. "They just needed to be reminded that truth is stronger than fear." Children approached his porch, tugging at his sleeves, smiling brightly. "Thank you," one little girl said, holding up a small lantern painted with flowers, "for making the bad lady go away." He bent down, taking the lantern gently in his hands, his calm voice steady. "She went away because you all stood together. This valley belongs to you." The children beamed before running back to their games, their laughter echoing across the lake. Across town, Karen sat alone in her darkened house. The red jacket she once wore like a crown hung limp over a chair, ignored. The curtains were drawn, but even through the fabric she saw the glow of lanterns outside, heard the distant chants and cheers. Each sound stabbed at her, reminding her of everything she had lost. She poured herself another glass of wine with trembling hands, whispering to herself, "They'll regret it. They'll see they need me." But her voice cracked, weak and hollow. Deep down she knew the truth. They no longer feared her. They never would again. Back at the lake, the neighbors began to light lanterns one by one, carrying them down to the water. The man's family joined them, walking quietly to the shore. Hundreds of glowing lights floated gently onto the surface, drifting together, their flames burning against the darkness. The reflection was dazzling, a river of stars flowing across the lake. People clasped hands, their voices joining in one final chant that rolled like thunder across the valley. No more fear. No more lies. No more fear. The man stood among them, his calm eyes watching the flames. He raised his voice once, not loudly, but enough for all to hear. Fear ruled this valley for too long. But tonight, you proved it was never stronger than you. Guard this freedom, protect this truth, and remember, fear is loud, but truth endures. The crowd cheered, their voices rising higher than the lanterns themselves. As the night stretched on, the celebrations grew warmer. Families danced, neighbors embraced, children splashed in the water, their joy ringing out like bells. For the first time in decades, there were no fines, no threats, no rules binding their joy. Only freedom. Later, when the lanterns burned low and the streets quieted again, the man returned to his porch. His wife rested her head on his shoulder, their children curled asleep nearby, their faces peaceful. He looked out at the valley, the faint glow of the last lanterns drifting on the lake, and whispered, "It is finally over." His wife squeezed his hand gently. "No," she said, smiling softly. "It's finally beginning." The dawn came quietly, painting the sky in gold and silver. The valley awoke not with fear, but with laughter and light. Neighbors greeted each other warmly in the streets. Children played freely, and the pool, once a place of shame, rang with splashes of joy. The man stepped out onto his porch, the leather folder tucked away inside, no longer needed. He breathed in the crisp morning air, his calm eyes steady on the rising sun. The valley was free, and the truth had won. And as the sunlight spread across the hills and the lake, the people knew this day would never be forgotten. Fear had ended. A new beginning had come.